Hi. Hello, everyone. This is a different talk, obviously. This is about a color picker I built for weaving, so let's get into it. Hello, this is me and my loom, who is from the late 1930s. She's really big and really old, and I love her so much. I started weaving in 2013 on this loom because it seemed like a good fit for me and my other yarn collecting hobbies. It's gone pretty well since then. Weaving, it was really interesting to me because it has a long history intertwined with the history of computers. However, that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about the decisions that go into a piece of fabric that I make and how I use computers to help me make them. So what is weaving? I don't expect literally anyone to know what weaving is. Weaving is the process of making fabric using a loom. The loom will hold the lengthwise warp threads taut, and it can raise and lower them so that the weaver can pass the weft threads over and under the warp threads, forming the structure of the fabric. I'm going to talk a lot about warp and weft in this talk. You don't need to know anything else about weaving for the most part. It helps to remember that wefts go from left to right, and warps are the ones that go up and down. So in the piece on the right that you see, it has a white warp that's almost entirely covered by the black and yellow weft. That means the piece is weft dominant because you mostly only see the weft, but other pieces of fabric can be warp dominant, or most of them are balanced, which means you can see both the warp and the weft at the same time, which is useful. So a little story about these towels. As a weaver, one of the things that fascinates me is the series of decisions that go into every piece of cloth. Like, why are things the way they are? Weaving is a really complex process, and 50% or more of the work that goes into my weaving is planning and setup. Making good decisions is really important because, if you make a bad decision, it sort of propagates through. The part that we think about as weaving, where, there's a weaver sitting and doing the thing with the loom and throwing the shuttle back and forth, that's the second to last step in the process. Before I even touch my loom, I have to decide what I am making and what makes this project successful. So what yarn do I use? What structure suits my goals? I have to think about how it will behave while I'm weaving and also afterwards when it's a piece of cloth that I'm using. Some decisions are really easy, like don't make wool towels, but others are really tricky, like what colors do I use in these towels that I'm giving to somebody else? Color choices can be really hard because you have to think about how the colors will blend, and they like to surprise you. The towels you see over there are my least favorite project, probably. I thought the purple and brown would be really pretty together, and they look really bad in person. Most people that work with color have experienced this, where the colors that look good separately blended into icky mud. So you can solve this. The traditional weaving way to do that is to make a bunch of samples and inspect them and then make your decisions. But that's pretty slow and boring and can be expensive if your yarn's really expensive, and it doesn't always work. So a lot of people don't like making samples. I don't. Clearly, making these horrible towels didn't stop me from weaving, but it did make me kind of cautious about colors. A couple years after I made those towels, which was also a couple years ago, I signed up for a weaving class that promised you could weave a whole set of coordinated kitchen textiles. So, towels, aprons, placemats, table runners, napkins, pot holders, rugs, anything you want to use in the kitchen. And you only have to set up your loom once, and they will do most of the work for you, right? That sounds incredible. 50% of my time goes into planning and setup. So if I can go someplace where they take care of that for me, I have twice as much weaving time. And then this is what I came home with after 4 days of weaving. I made 9 yards of fabric, which was honestly kind of a cool personal record for me. I learned a lot about the decisions you can make while you're weaving. So you can change your colors, you can change the texture of the fabric. But I also learned a lot about how making good decisions up front really changes the quality of your final project. The class was coming up. They sent me this image, which is some yarn wrapped around a ruler. It's like a quick and easy way to make a sample, but without doing any actual weaving. But you do have to have all of the yarns on hand, which is fine if you're a weaving store and not great if you are a person who lives in a small apartment. Based on this design, I had to pick the colors I wanted to use from the 76 colors this yarn comes in. So there's 5 separate colors. There's 76 possibilities. That's 2.2 trillion opportunities to make really, really ugly towels. And I was terrified, obviously. That's an intimidating amount of choices. But here's what I did. I built a color picker using the product images for this yarn off of the school website. There are literally divs with background images and a little form that lets me change the color code in the image URLs. It sounds totally cheap and botched together, and it is, and it totally worked. I picked out my colors and I shared the tool with my classmates, and they loved it. And that's kind of where I expected this project to end, but it didn't. This was a huge hit with my classmates and the staff at the school. They asked if I would be up for building a more general purpose stripe tool, and of course I was, like, that's what I do. My janky demo with one stripe pattern and one yarn turned into a whole web app with a color palette and multiple types of yarn and stripe patterns and a huge log of backlog product requests. Right? Like that's success in software. Like you have people using it who want more. And so you're like, yes, I did it. I'm so powerful. When the pandemic hit and classes had to shut down, we started stress testing it with kits that people could design and weave at home. And that was all great, but there was one piece missing. Remember how colors like to surprise you? So the problem with these towels wasn't that the purple and brown looked bad next to each other, but that they blended in a really gross way. So the top half of this picture, you can see what they look like unwoven, just like stripes next to each other. But the bottom half shows you what it looks like once you start passing the left back and forth. The brown stripes stand out a lot because the yarns are the same color, so they kind of reinforce each other. But the purple stripes kind of fade into this weird, funky horribleness. My stripe tool could have shown me the unwoven stripes, and I might have made better decisions based on that, but it wouldn't have told me what the final cloth would look like. So hasn't anyone solved this already, right? Weaving has been around for 8,000 years. Somebody at some point, probably between the advent of computers and now, should have, figured out how to deal with this. And they kind of have. There's a whole category of software for weavers called weaving software that's used to design cloth and optionally control computer-driven looms. You can do really cool things with it. However, it is expensive, and it has a steep learning curve, and it is not designed for picking colors. This is Fiberworks, which is a very popular and feature-rich weaving software suite, which I use personally, and its color palette is almost as good as MS Paint. Like, how do you even get accurate colors using this? You don't. You can, with some work, find an accurate RGB color for a given yarn, then input it and use it in your design. And if you're really dedicated, you might convert all 76 colors of this yarn to RGB and enter those and redo that every time you want to make a new project. And that's terrible. I've done it once. Just don't. Nobody does this. What actually happens is that people pick colors that are close enough and hope for the best. And it's a great way to be surprised, usually in a bad way. But unlike Fiberworks, we have a color palette that works for us. It's built into the stripe tool. It's specific to one kind of yarn, but that's how yarn actually works. You either buy it from a company with a large range of consistent colors, or you dye it yourself. People who dye their own yarn are generally pretty happy with surprises because it kind of comes with the territory. But the rest of us tend to just buy our yarn, and that's a pretty big group of people, honestly. So people who buy yarn online are already familiar with these palettes because that's how yarn is sold. Like, you pick one of these swatches when you're buying yarn. You don't tell them, I just want red. So the flexibility of that's built into Fiberworks with its complete RGB color system actually works against them, because very few people actually want to convert these swatches into RGB colors. It's just not fun. So we have everything we need, right? Like, we've got the color palette that works, and we have enough HTML to be dangerous. So we can have weaving software with really accurate colors, and it's pretty straightforward. So some quick background more about weaving. This is what a weaving draft looks like. The bars on the bottom and on the right have weaving instructions, and the large center section shows you what the woven cloth will look like. Every pixel in the center represents one thread crossing over another, and whatever thread on top is the one that's visible. It's a fun logic to do it's a fun logic puzzle to make one of these by hand, but obviously it's a lot faster to have a computer build it for you. The stripe tool used divs because that was good enough, but this requires more complexity, and that's where SVG comes in. If you're not familiar with SVG, it's just a tool that lets you draw based on coordinates, like draw a rectangle that's 100 by 200 starting at some specific point. The skeleton of the draft we can draw based on those rectangles, and then the colors are defined by patterns. You can describe your warp and your weft stripe with patterns in SVG, and then make a mask that describes the texture of the cloth based on the weaving instructions that you can see in the draft. If the warp thread should be on top, then the mask will let the warp color through, or it will cover it with the weft color, just like the way fabric works. To change the colors, you only have to change the warp or the weft pattern, which is great because that's computationally very cheap. If you're editing it and you're changing the weaving instructions, all you have to do is, recompute and redraw that section of the mask, and it's still like pretty fast to do in the browser, which I think was my initial biggest concern about this. Like, is it going to be performant? And it was. So I want to end by showing you the kind of power this tool has. These are all the same design in different colors. The staff at the weaving school was really, really excited for this. And they made a whole series of designs based on celestial bodies, and I think they're incredible. Some of the colors are super subtle, so others are very contrasty, and it's all possible because computers and weaving are best friends like peanut butter and chocolate. And so that's it. I want to say thank you to the staff at the school and my classmates for all of their ideas and inspiration and feedback and bug reports. I couldn't do it without them and without the backup of my weaving community in general. Thank you all for coming to my talk and hanging out, and I'll be around on Discord to answer any other questions you have about weaving or literally anything else. It's been great. Bye.